The air in the grand study, usually filled with the comforting scent of old books and my grandfather's pipe tobacco, felt suddenly thick, suffocating. The lawyer's voice, a dry drone listing assets and beneficiaries, seemed distant, as if echoing from another room. My eyes, still blurred from the grief of losing my beloved grandfather, Charles Hayes, rested on the heavy mahogany desk where he used to sketch his groundbreaking designs. Then, the specific words, "To my granddaughter, Sophia Hayes, I bequeath full ownership and operational control of Hayes Technologies," pierced through the haze. A fragile hope, a fragile future, seemed to solidify around me. But before I could even fully process the magnitude of his trust, my mother, Victoria, stood up, her posture rigid, her hand pressing firmly onto Robert Maxwell's arm. Robert, my stepfather, whom she had married less than a year ago. From now on, my mother declared, her voice unervingly steady, cutting through the stunned silence, Robert will be in charge of the company. It's only practical. I blinked. My heart, already aching, felt a sharp, cold jab. Robert? The man who had spent the past 6 months making offhand comments about how someone my age couldn't handle real responsibility? I looked around the room. My aunts, my uncles, even some of the board members present, silent. Their faces were impassive, as if this had already been decided, a foregone conclusion orchestrated behind closed doors. Robert offered me a small, smug smile, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. In that moment, the grief solidified into a cold, hard resolve. My grandfather's legacy, my birthright, stolen right before my eyes. They had no idea that this calculated betrayal was merely the prelude to a battle they could never win. My name is Sophia Hayes, and I had always believed in the power of blood, the sanctity of family legacy. My entire life had been shaped by my deep bond with my grandfather, Charles Hayes, the visionary founder of Hayes Technologies, a multi-million-dollar technology company. He had meticulously prepared me to inherit his life's work, placing his complete trust in my abilities. However, upon his death, my mother, Victoria, seemingly manipulated by my cunning stepfather, Robert Maxwell, immediately appointed Robert as CEO, effectively stripping me of my rightful inheritance and leadership role. Left feeling utterly betrayed and powerless by my own family, I resolved to meticulously expose their incompetence and schemes, ultimately orchestrating a strategic takeover to reclaim my family's legacy and ensure their complete and public downfall. My childhood was woven into the very fabric of Hayes Technologies. From the moment I could walk, my grandfather, Charles Hayes, was my world. He wasn't just a grandparent. He was a mentor, a confidant, and the most brilliant mind I had ever known. He had built Hayes Technologies from a small garage startup into a multi-million-dollar technology powerhouse, driven by a passion for innovation and a deep ethical compass. Unlike my mother, Victoria, who was often preoccupied with social engagements and maintaining appearances, my grandfather saw something in me, a curiosity, a drive, a knack for understanding complex systems that mirrored his own. While my peers played with dolls, I spent my afternoons in Charles's home workshop, watching him tinker with prototypes, asking endless questions about circuits and algorithms. He never dismissed my queries, no matter how simple. Instead, he patiently explained, encouraging my burgeoning interest in technology. As I grew older, our bond deepened. Summers were spent not at fancy camps, but at Hayes Technologies, where he personally guided me through various departments. I learned about engineering, product development, marketing, and the intricate dance of corporate strategy. He taught me the company's core values, integrity, relentless innovation, and respect for every employee. He instilled in me a profound love for the business, for the people, and for the groundbreaking work we did. Sophia, he'd often say, his eyes twinkling, you have the Hayes fire. This company, it's in your blood. You understand it better than anyone. These words were not just encouragement, They were a quiet promise of a future I deeply desired. My mother, Victoria, had always been a complex figure. After my parents' divorce when I was young, she focused on rebuilding her own life, which often felt separate from mine and my grandfather's shared world. She was gracious, charming in social settings, but less engaged with the technical realities of Hayes Technologies. While she respected my grandfather's success, she seemed to view the company more as a source of wealth and status than a living entity. Her remarriage to Robert Maxwell, less than a year before Charles's passing, was a source of quiet tension. Robert was a smooth talker, a former real estate developer with a flashy smile and an almost unsettling charm. He had appeared in our lives seemingly out of nowhere, sweeping my mother off her feet. He had no background in technology or engineering, yet he quickly began to insert himself into family discussions about Hayes Technologies, often offering unsolicited business advice. Charles, with his sharp, perceptive mind, seemed wary of Robert. I remember one evening, just a few months before he fell ill, he pulled me aside. "Sophia," he said, his voice low, "I've made certain provisions for the company. It's critical that my vision, our values, continue. You understand that, don't you?" I nodded, confused by his solemn tone, but confident in his wisdom. He never explicitly mentioned Robert, but his eyes held a knowing look, a subtle red flag that I, in my youthful naivety, didn't fully grasp until it was too late. Robert, meanwhile, began to make subtle, dismissive comments about my involvement with Hayes Technologies. "So, still playing in the labs, Sophia?" he'd ask with a patronizing smile. "Real business is quite different, you know." He seemed to assume my interest was a mere hobby, not a genuine passion cultivated over decades. My mother, surprisingly, never corrected him. Her silence, I would soon realize, was its own form of betrayal. Charles's health had been declining for a few months, but his passing was still sudden, a devastating blow. The grief was profound, a raw, aching void in my life. It was in this state of vulnerability, overwhelmed by sorrow, that the seeds of Robert's and my mother's betrayal were sown, blossoming in the cold, unfeeling formality of the well-reading. The legacy my grandfather had so carefully built and so clearly intended for me was about to be snatched away by those closest to me. The day the will was read remains etched in my memory with the chilling precision of a nightmare. The large, somber meeting room at the law firm was packed, a gathering of family and key board members, all dressed in varying shades of black, their faces solemn, some genuinely mournful, others merely formal. My own grief was a heavy cloak, muffling the sounds around me, blurring the faces. I sat stiffly, trying to absorb the reality of my grandfather's absence, the man who had been the anchor of my life. The lawyer, Mr. Davison, a man with thin spectacles and a precise manner, began to read, his voice devoid of emotion. He went through personal bequests, small properties, and financial trusts. My mother, Victoria, sat beside me, her expression unreadable. Across the table, Robert Maxwell sat beside her, his usual boisterous charm muted, replaced by a composed, almost expectant demeanor. My heart quickened slightly as the lawyer cleared his throat, signaling the transition to the more significant assets. "And now," Mr. Davison announced, his voice gaining a slightly more formal tone, regarding Hayes Technologies. "My client, Charles Hayes, having full confidence in her capabilities and unwavering dedication to the company's vision, has specifically designated his granddaughter, Sophia Hayes, as the sole inheritor of all his shares and the designated CEO. Effective immediately upon the reading of this will." The words hung in the air, a breathtaking validation of everything my grandfather and I had built. A quiet gasp rippled through the room. I felt a surge of warmth, a flicker of light piercing through my grief. This was it. The future Charles had envisioned for us, was now real. My eyes welled up, not with sorrow, but with profound gratitude. I glanced at my mother, expecting to see pride, or at least understanding. Her face was a mask of cold resolve. Before I could even speak, before the board members could react, my mother stood up. Her movements were swift, decisive. She placed a firm, possessive hand on Robert's arm, her gaze sweeping over the room, challenging anyone to object. Her voice, steady and self-assured, cut through the quiet like a sharpened knife. From now on, she declared, her tone leaving no room for argument, Robert will be in charge of the company. It's only practical. Sophia, bless her heart, is simply too young, too inexperienced. She needs time to mature. I blinked. My mind reeled. Robert? The room, which had been silent, now felt ice cold. Robert offered me a small, dismissive smirk, a flash of triumph in his eyes. Yes, as Victoria rightly says, he chimed in, his voice smoothly condescending. Running a multi-million-dollar corporation requires a certain, seasoned touch. Sophia's talents are certainly valued, perhaps in a supporting role. His words, casually delivered, were designed to cut me down, to invalidate my grandfather's dying wish. I looked around the room. No one else seemed surprised. My aunts, my uncles, even some of the board members present, silent. Their faces were impassive, as if this had already been decided, a foregone conclusion orchestrated behind closed doors. The betrayal hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing my breath, stealing my voice. My mother's steely gaze met mine, devoid of empathy, replaced by a chilling pragmatism. In that moment, the raw grief transformed into a cold, burning fury. My grandfather's trust, my rightful inheritance, his legacy, all of it was being stolen, not by strangers, but by the very people who were supposed to be my family. I had to fight, and I would make them pay for every single word, for every stolen dream. The days following the will reading were a blur of frantic, desperate attempts to reclaim what was rightfully mine. My initial shock quickly morphed into a furious scramble for justice. I immediately confronted my mother, seeking an explanation, a retraction, anything to undo the cold, public slight. Mother, how could you? I pleaded, my voice raw with disbelief. Grandfather trusted me. He prepared me. But Victoria was unyielding. Her face, usually so expressive, was now a mask of unwavering conviction, almost as if she were reciting a rehearsed script. Sophia, you're being emotional. Robert is experienced. He knows how to handle big business. Your grandfather was, perhaps a little sentimental in his old age. She dismissed my pleas with a wave of her hand, attributing my grandfather's trust in me to senility, a cruel twist of the knife. Robert, hovering in the background, offered sympathetic platitudes while his eyes held a triumphant glint. I tried to appeal to the board members, those who had served under my grandfather for years. I presented them with my detailed plans for Hayes Technologies, the very strategies Charles and I had developed. I reminded them of my long history with the company, my deep understanding of its technology and its culture. But they merely offered vague assurances, citing the need for stability during transition and respect for Victoria's wishes. They were afraid, perhaps, of alienating my mother, or more likely, intimidated by Robert's sudden rise to power. His charisma, once a superficial charm, now seemed to possess a sinister undertone of manipulative control. I felt utterly alone, isolated within my own family. Robert wasted no time solidifying his control. Within weeks, he began to make sweeping changes, dismissing long-standing employees whom he deemed Charles's loyalists and bringing in his own cronies, inexperienced but undeniably devoted to him. He started pushing for immediate, high-risk projects, focusing on short-term gains over the long-term innovation that my grandfather had championed. He held lavish press conferences, basking in the glow of the media, presenting himself as the visionary who would propel Hayes Technologies into a new era. Each news headline, each glowing profile of Robert Maxwell, the new face of Hayes Technologies, was a fresh wound, a reminder of what he had stolen. His arrogance grew with every successful public appearance, making him utterly blind to the quiet storm I was beginning to brew. The initial frantic energy gradually gave way to a cold, calculated calm. It became clear that direct confrontation was useless. They had legally outmaneuvered me and emotionally isolated me. My only path forward was to fight fire with fire, to use my grandfather's own lessons in strategy and precision. I decided to strike where Robert was weakest, his competence and integrity. I would not just reclaim Hayes Technologies, I would expose him for the fraud he was. I began my silent investigation, a meticulous deep dive into Robert's past and his current operations within Hayes Technologies. I covertly accessed old company archives, utilizing the knowledge of internal systems my grandfather had taught me. I found inconsistencies in Robert's resume, inflated claims about his previous real estate ventures, and a pattern of quick, lucrative deals followed by quiet disappearances. He wasn't a builder, he was a liquidator, a man who stripped assets for quick profit. I also began scrutinizing the financial decisions he was making at Hayes Technologies. His new, high-risk projects seemed designed not for long-term growth, but for short-term stock bumps, perhaps to facilitate a rapid sell-off. My most crucial move was quietly connecting with those Robert had alienated. Disgruntled former employees, some of whom had worked with my grandfather for decades, expressed their deep concern about the company's new direction. They shared stories of Robert's tyrannical management style, his lack of technical understanding, and his increasing disregard for ethical guidelines. I also discreetly reached out to a few board members who, despite their initial silence, harbored growing doubts about Robert's leadership. They revered Charles and were worried about the company's future under Robert's erratic guidance. I presented them with carefully selected pieces of information, never explicitly stating my intentions, but subtly planting seeds of doubt and concern. This clandestine network of allies became my eyes and ears within the very walls of Hayes Technologies, helping me to gather the critical intelligence I needed. Robert was too busy flaunting his new power to notice the growing disquiet beneath the surface. With my network established and a mountain of evidence accumulating, I began to lay the intricate trap for Robert. My target was his latest, most ambitious project, a massive government contract that promised to be the ultimate feather in his cap, solidifying his reputation as a tech titan. It was a project that, ironically, involved a sector of engineering I knew intimately, having worked on similar concepts with my grandfather years ago. Robert, with his superficial understanding of the technology, had made critical errors in the bid, over-promising capabilities and underestimating technical complexities. My strategy was multifaceted. First, I leaked carefully anonymized documents detailing Robert's past questionable business practices to a tenacious investigative journalist known for exposing corporate malfeasance. The journalist, intrigued by the hints of a major scandal at Hayes Technologies, began her own discreet inquiries, confirming the patterns of deceit I had uncovered. Simultaneously, I used my knowledge of the company's outdated internal systems to subtly expose vulnerabilities in their data security for the government bid, not causing a full breach, but raising enough red flags to trigger an internal audit by the government agency reviewing the contract. The pressure on Robert began to mount. He became increasingly erratic, snapping at employees, clashing with the few remaining loyal board members, and demanding impossible deadlines. The internal audit slowed down the government contract review, causing significant delays and cost overruns. Rumors of his past business failures began to circulate through the industry, fueled by the journalists' quiet inquiries. My brothers, Michael and Christopher, initially dismissive, now showed signs of unease. They were constantly on the phone with Robert, their voices strained. My mother, Victoria, looked increasingly tired, her unwavering support for Robert beginning to fray under the relentless, unspoken pressure. Robert was too arrogant, too confident in his own charm, to realize that the walls were closing in, meticulously constructed by the very person he had publicly dismissed as too young. The stage was set for the dramatic reveal, the moment he would finally realize the true cost of underestimating me. The annual shareholders' meeting of Hayes Technologies was traditionally a dull affair, a formality to approve reports and endorse the board. But this year, it was the crucible of Robert Maxwell's fate. He stood at the podium, a forced smile plastered on his face, attempting to rally the disgruntled shareholders after months of negative press, plummeting stock prices, and the stalled government contract. My mother, Victoria, sat rigid in the front row, her face pale, her usual poise visibly strained. I sat several rows back, my heart a calm, steady drum against my ribs, my hands resting on a sleek, discreet tablet. The moment of reckoning was finally here. Robert began his speech, painting a rosy picture of the company's future, dismissing the current woes as temporary market fluctuations and unfortunate bureaucratic delays. He spoke of his visionary leadership and how he was steering Hayes Technologies into a new, prosperous era, completely detached from reality. He was a master of self-deception, utterly blind to the trap I had set. As he spoke, a nervous murmur rippled through the room. A large screen behind him, usually displaying company metrics, flickered. Then it sprang to life, hijacked by an anonymous, unscheduled broadcast. Robert froze mid-sentence, his smile dissolving. On the screen, a meticulously compiled video presentation began to play for all to see. It started with a recording of Robert's own voice, lifted from a security camera in his private office, where he was caught on tape brazenly discussing a plan to strip assets from a struggling subsidiary he had recently acquired. It then seamlessly transitioned to irrefutable financial documents, laid bare for all the shareholders, inflated project costs, fraudulent expense reports, and shell corporations used to siphon off company funds into his personal accounts. The presentation detailed his disastrous decisions, the exact moments he had cut corners on critical safety tests for the government bid, leading to its colossal failure. It even included a snippet of an interview with a former associate from his real estate days, who explicitly detailed Robert's history of leveraging debt to gain control of companies, only to bleed them dry and disappear. Robert's face, projected onto the massive screen beside the damning evidence, contorted in a grotesque dance of disbelief, then horror, and finally, pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged at the screen, shouting, "This is fake. This is slander," but his voice was drowned out by the uproar in the room. Shareholders were on their feet, screaming, demanding answers. My brothers, Michael and Christopher, sat frozen, their faces ashen, utterly exposed by their association with him. The climax arrived when the final slide appeared on the screen, showing a clear, concise summary of the financial damages, the compromised intellectual property, and the legal liabilities Robert had brought upon Hayes Technologies. Below it, in stark white letters, was a single line of text, authored and presented by Sophia Hayes, Founders Legacy Initiative. The camera on the live stream, responding to a pre-programmed command, zoomed in on my face in the audience, calm and resolute. I met Robert's wild, desperate eyes across the room. He knew I had done this. He opened his mouth, but no sound escaped, only a choked gurgle of defeat. The board members, now furious, converged on him, demanding his resignation, threatening legal action. He had tried to steal my grandfather's legacy, to humiliate me, and now I had reclaimed it by stripping him of everything he cherished. His ill-gotten power, his fabricated reputation, and his freedom. The surprise was absolute. In the chaotic aftermath of that infamous shareholders' meeting, Robert Maxwell's world and the false reality he had created for my mother collapsed with spectacular speed. Hayes Technologies, once a titan of engineering, became a symbol of corporate malfeasance. Investigations launched by angry shareholders and regulatory bodies quickly unearthed a labyrinth of financial irregularities ethical breaches, and fraudulent practices. Michael and Christopher, despite their frantic attempts to distance themselves, were caught in the legal net, facing charges for their complicity and negligence. Their names, once synonymous with power and succession, were now mud. Robert himself, stripped of his titles, his wealth, and his precious reputation, became a recluse, his public image shattered beyond repair. His legacy was not one of discipline and pride, but of deceit and ruin. As for Hayes Technologies, the path to recovery was long and arduous. But with Robert gone, and my rightful place as CEO confirmed by a now grateful board, I could begin the work of healing. I systematically purged his cronies, restored the company's ethical guidelines, and rehired many of my grandfather's loyal employees. I focused on long-term innovation, just as Charles had taught me, prioritizing cutting-edge research and development over short-term profits. Under my leadership, Hayes Technologies slowly regained its reputation, its financial stability, and its place as a leader in the industry. It was a painstaking process, but every step was a tribute to my grandfather's vision and a testament to my own resilience. My life, once defined by the shadow of my father's dismissal and the pain of Robert's betrayal, was now characterized by profound purpose. The company wasn't just a business, it was my true family, my legacy, meticulously rebuilt from the ashes of deceit. The revenge, while consuming in its execution, ultimately freed me. It wasn't about bitterness in the end, but about honoring my grandfather's trust, correcting a grave injustice, and proving, to myself and to the world, that competence and integrity always prevail over arrogance and deceit. I often reflect on that moment in the study, when Robert smirked and my mother dismissed me. They thought they had won. They didn't know that their betrayal had ignited a fire within me, a resolve so fierce it could dismantle empires. My little surprise was not just their downfall, it was my ascension.